Hello and welcome to a special installment of Slant Alpha Adventures. We have a series of tutorials geared toward helping new members get connected to the VATSIM network, and one of the first questions a new member might ask oneself is, what should I put in for a call sign? We're going to cover the basics here. We'll talk about a handful of call signs you can't use, and we'll go over what those are. Now outside of that, the rule is that you can use anything you want. The preference, though, is that you use a call sign that's realistic for the type of operation that you're doing. And we'll cover what that means, and we'll even talk a little bit about why it's important. Generally speaking, call signs you'd use as a pilot on VATSIM will fall into one of three main categories: air carrier call signs, private call signs, aka general aviation, and military call signs, including both service call signs and tactical call signs. Now, note, there are some rules about flying military missions on VATSIM that you need to be aware of, and we'll touch on those a little bit as well. For starters, let's talk about what call signs you cannot use on VATSIM. For one, you can't use a call sign that's reserved for VATSIM staff, and that means staff on any level of VATSIM. Here are a few examples. However, a comprehensive list of all reserved call signs would go on for days. But don't worry, trust me, if you follow the guidelines for realistic call signs that I'm going to lay out in the rest of this tutorial, you'll see it's truly not possible to accidentally use a reserved staff call sign. Another thing that you can't do would be to use a call sign that is obscene, vulgar, profane, or what have you. I'll leave it to your imagination as to what some of those might look like. But lastly, you can't use a call sign which violates paragraph A17 of the VATSIM Code of Conduct. I'll leave a link to the Code of Conduct in the video description, but let's take a peek at it here. Paragraph A17 prohibits reenacting historical aviation accidents or incidents on the network, and in fact there are a handful of very high-profile call signs that you can't ever use on VATSIM, which are also retired in the real world. If you want to see that list, you can click on the link there in paragraph A17. Okay, enough about what you can't do. Let's talk about call signs you can and should use. Probably the most common format a VATSIM pilot call sign will take is an air carrier call sign. These are going to start with a 3-letter identifier, then followed by anywhere from 1 to 4 numbers usually, though you will sometimes see some letters there too, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, it's important to ensure you're using the 3-letter ICAO identifier for your airline, not the 2-letter IATA one that shows up on your passenger ticket, and not the airline name spelled out. So for example, use DAL instead of DL, and definitely don't spell out Delta. If you need to figure out what your airline's ICAO code is, well, Google generally knows all. You definitely want to use this one and not this one. And as a side note, although I don't mention it in the slide here, it is perfectly okay to use a historical one or even a fictional one here too. It doesn't have to be a currently existing real-world one. You might ask yourself, what's the big deal if I write out Delta? Well, other pilots' pilot client programs are going to use your call sign to try to figure out what kind of airplane to put in the other pilot's sim to represent you. And it's going to look at that code to see what paint scheme should be on the plane it's going to use for you. So it's going to look for that code DAL. And if instead you put DEL or DL, or if you spelled out Delta there, it's anyone's guess as to what everyone else's pilot client is going to use to show you. So if you want to be seen, for example, as a Delta plane, you got to use the correct code for Delta, DAL. The flight ID number is pretty easy if you're in the US. It's just the flight number. Now, outside the US, sometimes they now use a separate flight ID number which could end in a letter or even 2 letters. Let's look, for example, at this guy. You can see that he's Ryanair Flight 381, but where his ICAO identifier is, he's RYR7 Hotel Uniform. In Europe, they started doing this to try to reduce the number of similar sounding call signs on the radio together. In the US, though, they just use the same flight number in the call sign that the passengers see. Now, another important note is how we say these over the radio. And the airline's call sign isn't always just the name of the airline plus the flight ID. Sometimes their call signs are something different or unique. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at some. For example, we have Southwest and its identifier SWA. On the radio, it's simply Southwest plus the flight number. But as a different example, let's look at United. UAL, and on the radio, United. Now, let's look at Delta, DAL. Okay. All right, let's go to Europe. Here's British Airways, BAW. Now, you might imagine that's just British Airways and the flight number. But no, this one would be Speedbird. So if you're logged in as BAW 6 November Charlie, that's Speedbird 6 November Charlie. Or I guess I should say Speedbud 6 November Charlie. Aer Lingus, they log on as EIN, but when spoken, they're called Schambrak. One interesting historical one from the U.S. was U.S. Air. Now, they actually went through several different call signs over the years because they merged up with several other airlines along the way. But the most recent one they used was AWE for America West, and they went by Cactus. Likewise, Pan American, the iconic PAA identifier, was spoken as Clipper. And honestly, some of the cooler American ones these days belong to the regional air carriers. You get call signs like Brickyard and Water Ski and some really fun ones. Anyway, the other thing that you need to know about the spoken call signs is that sometimes you say the flight numbers in grouped form, generally in the US, and other times you say each digit individually. So, for example, this guy, as he climbs out from Brussels, Belgium, and comes through Europe, he's going to be Delta 141. But once he gets stateside, they're mostly going to be calling him Delta 141. The other thing to reiterate is that it is okay just to make up a number. A lot of VATSIM pilots do like to match up their online flights with ones from the real world, but it's by no means a requirement. So that wraps up air carrier call signs. Let's move on to general aviation, which for the most part means privately owned aircraft. Normally, GA call signs are basically just the registration number, the number painted on the plane, also called the plane's tail number. And note, you don't have to use the one depicted in your SIM's livery. Again, you can just make one up. In the US, they're also called N numbers because they all start with N. Then after that, there could be up to 5 numbers, or the last 1 or 2 could be substituted with letters. There's a couple other little nuances to it. I'll drop a link to this page here in the video description. But outside the US, the normal GA format is 5 letters. The first 1 or 2 letters are a country code, and the rest are then just randomly assigned. Here's an example of one that starts with G, which is a British registration. In Canada, all the registrations start with C as in Charlie, although I actually think the second letter is almost always G. In Australia, the country code is VH, Victor Hotel. One important thing to note is that when you log on to VATSIM with these, you should remove the dash and just type the 5 letters all together. Now, one final note is that there are services like 4Flight or FlightPlan.com which allow private aircraft to file as flights with air carrier-like call signs, meaning 3 letters followed by up to 4 numbers. And you do occasionally see those on VATSIM as well, and that's fine. Now, military call signs. As I mentioned before, there are some rules about flying military missions on VATSIM. It's mentioned in the Code of Conduct. And then there's a whole separate document which goes into the specifics. If you want to see the whole policy, I'll include the link in the video description, and you can read through that on your own. The short version is this. You're perfectly welcome to fly a military aircraft type under a military call sign if the type of flight that you're doing could also be done in a civilian type and call sign. So if that's the case, you're fine. Anything special like air-to-air refueling or combat or bombing or attack runs, don't do it as a new VATSIM member. I recommend that you start with more civilian-like flying, commercial or private, and then if you want, you can explore the VSOA once you get more familiar with the network. Now, if you are just doing a normal flight and you want to use a military type and call sign, you certainly can. The U.S. Armed Services each have a specific identifier which will be followed by essentially like a flight number. So Victor Victor 246 would be Navy 246. And Charlie 571 would be Coast Guard 571, and so forth. By the way, for military, they do usually say these numbers out digit by digit, even in the U.S. Now, by that logic, you would think Air Force One should log on just as A1, but they do typically use AF1. One thing to note, though, is on VATSIM, pilots who log on as Air Force One do not get any kind of priority handling. And I'm going to be brutally honest here. Most people who log on as Air Force One are about to try some Hollywood hotshot BS, like saving the life of the president when all 4 engines inexplicably explode. So if your planned flight includes the use of the phrase, Mayday, Mayday, this is Air Force One, we're going down, then just trust me, the controllers on this network have seen that garbage hundreds of times, and you're going to stand out, but not for anywhere even close to the reasons that you think you are. So, long story short, use of the call sign Air Force One is allowed, but not recommended, at least by me. And you don't get any special treatment if you do, except that the controllers are pretty much going to assume you're basically a joke. So, anyway, rant over. Moving on. Military tactical call signs are kind of the more fun ones. They come from the squadron names, and they're logged on as generally some sort of pronounceable word of some sort, shortened down to 5 letters, and then 1 or 2 digits after that. And again, the digits are usually spoken out one at a time. So the examples here would be Buster 6, Devil 14, Gargoyle 21, and so forth. And again, it's okay to make one up as well, as long as it's not obscene or what have you. Then finally to mention, the military services outside of the U.S. generally have a 3-letter ICAO identifier. So their call signs are going to go back to that air carrier format that we talked about on the earlier slide. All right, so let's recap. When you're choosing a call sign on VATSIM, there's some that you can't use. Staff call signs, offensive call signs, or call signs tied into past aviation accidents or incidents. Most of the time, your call sign is going to take one of 3 major forms. Air carrier call signs, which are usually 3 letters, then 1 to 4 numbers, maybe a couple letters at the end. General aviation call signs, which might be USN numbers or might be 5 letters altogether. And then military call signs, which are either similar to air carrier call signs with special designators or tactical call signs, which are 5 letters followed by 1 or 2 numbers. Obviously, there are always going to be some variations and exceptions, but that covers the basics. Got it? Good. If you have questions, leave them in the comments or find me on any of the Slant Alpha Adventures social media venues. We'll see you live on Twitch TV, and we'll hope to see and hear you soon on the VATSIM network. Be healthy and safe in your own travels and own adventures in the meantime. Cheers.